So, welcome to a conversation about Guelph's growing city with Brent Toderian. My name is Krista Walkie, and I am the Chief Planner for the City of Guelph. It's exciting to be at this phase in our work on some significant master plans, including the city's official plan or our municipal comprehensive review and the comprehensive zoning bylaw. About 2.5 years ago, we launched these processes with the community, February 2020, as we all refer to it now, pre-COVID. At that event, you heard from three city builders: Todd Salter, Guelph's former chief planner; Pamela Robinson, the director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the newly named Toronto Metropolitan University; and Jennifer Keesmack, previously Toronto's chief planner. They shared their perspectives on growth and the evolution of cities, and tonight we'll reflect on where we've been and where we've got to in the past 2.5 years with another city builder, Brent Toderian. Some of the work that will be presented to Council and the community in July are based on a consultation process with our highly engaged community and its pride in Guelph and its unique character and attributes. We are planning a community to 2051, and that will include a future population of 208,000 residents and 116,000 jobs. We are visioning a community that is diverse, that is rich in history, and has a vibrant new place and spaces. We are welcoming new people to live and work within our neighborhoods, and we are welcoming new businesses that support and strengthen our diverse and innovative local economy. Our community will have a full range and mix of housing that is accessible and affordable. We will have a community where we can safely walk, cycle, ride transit, or drive where we want to go. Our city has been thoughtfully designed and is compact, connected, and complete. We have places to shop, to work, or to explore our open spaces in our parks. Our cultural heritage resources have been embraced and celebrated, and our natural heritage system and water resources are protected and maintained as one of our most valuable assets. In 2051, Guelph is a place that we are proud to call home. We are proud because we have worked together to shape its future. The official plan is a companion to the city's community plan, a plan that identifies the community and priorities to develop a welcoming and prosperous city. Together, the official plan and community plan create a strong foundation that will guide the future of Guelph. There has been a lot of engagement, comments, and suggestions to date. Can we achieve everything that has been forward as a suggestion? No. For example, the city is going to grow. It has grown in the past 30 years and will continue to grow in the next 30 years. But planning for how and where we grow and the forthcoming policy directions we'll be bringing forward to Council in July. But we've not done this alone. We have done this in working with our community partners, our residents, and our staff in transportation, finance, parks, accessibility, heritage, water, and wastewater. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to Brent Toderian. Brent is a global thought leader on advanced urbanism and a renowned planning advisor to cities around the world, within Canada, within Ontario, and we've been fortunate to work with Brent this week. He has over 30 years of experience in advanced urbanism, city planning, urban design, transportation, and change management. He has worked in and ran planning departments, and he has been able to share many ideas with us this week based on his experience and knowledge. So with that, Brent, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you very much, Krista, and thank you to Mayor and Council and all of the staff that have spent time with me this past week. This is day 4 of my week-long engagement with the City of Guelph staff, and it's been really, really interesting. It's not at all a sort of a random occurrence from my perspective. This is like fate in terms of, in a way, coming home, because for those of you who don't know, I spent my first 30 years of my life, I'm 52 years old, I spent the first 30 years of my life living in Ontario, and 13 of those years living in Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph. And I actually lived in all 3 of those cities, including 2 or 3 years living just on the edge of downtown Guelph. So for me, I wish I could be doing this in person, because I'm kind of dying to see how Guelph has been evolving And normally when I do these kinds of weeks with staff, we do it physically in person, and I get a chance to tour. I get a chance to walk and bike and take transit and drive and experience every way you get around the city and experience all the kinds of communities that make up Guelph now. And unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to do that this time because of the pandemic, but we've tried to make up for it with the remarkable growth in how well we all do in terms of living virtually these days. While I'm talking, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get going with my presentation. I've got about 45 minutes or so is the plan for what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. And let me see here. And how I'd like to start is by sort of setting the stage for my approach to my work with the City of Guelph staff, and frankly, how I'm going to address my comments to you tonight, because what I'm known for is bluntness. I often say I'm known for being blunt to a fault, but what I say is that I think what I try to do is constructive candor. I try to tell the truth. I try to always be honest with my assessment of where things are. I often say things that other city planners might not be willing to say out loud, but it's always constructive. It's not to feed anybody's ego. It's actually to try to get us to a place where we can actually be doing better as a city. I'm not here to impose my vision, my sense of how your city should be on top of you. Certainly not, since it's been many years since I've been to Guelph, and I've only had a week to work with your staff. So it's not about Brent's vision. But what I have done is spend a lot of time listening to your vision, getting a sense of all of the aspirations and goals that have been built into council approvals, previous conversations, and the existing work programs that are going on at City Hall, from the official plan to the zoning bylaw, etc. And essentially, I'm going to tell you the truth about what I think, as somebody who has been in the thick of city building in some of literally the best and most innovative cities in the world, not only across Canada, but across the world. And I'm going to tell you the truth about what I think, where I think you are, where I think you could go further, and frankly, how you're doing in the context of city making. And when it comes to where we all are, all of our cities, this is the word that defines, in my opinion, the era of city planning that we are in. We are in an era where we're not just trying to do a good job for the future. And as I say, I've been doing this for 30 years. We're in an era, and there have been times in my past where I've been, shall we say, very patient. We city planners are taught to be very patient and think like long-term thinkers, because your ideas and your achievements you'll eventually get there. But we're in the context of crisis management now. We're in the context of multiple crises that all Canadian cities are facing to certain extents. And to a large extent, we aren't taking those crises seriously enough in the context of our city planning and our city building. We all, I hope, know about the climate crisis. Most of us certainly understand the housing and affordability and even homelessness crisis that we face in our cities. We don't talk enough about the equity crisis in terms of equal and fair access for everybody to the city, from the disabled to racial injustice to ageism to all of the kinds of ways that we can try to keep people out of our neighborhoods and our cities, and the inherent unfairness of that. The public health crisis that we were already facing as a city before this pandemic, because we already had situations where we were basically designing our cities and our suburbs to weaken us, to hurt us, to harm our health, particularly in the way we've been designing our suburbs to literally push exercise out of our daily life. And so we already were in a public health crisis before this pandemic. And frankly, whether or not we fully get out of this pandemic or not, we are still going to be in the crisis that comes with all the preventable diseases and other health implications that particularly connect to car dependency and how much time we're spending in our cars. And yes, the infrastructure cost crisis, because literally North American cities are facing, in many cases, bankrupt scenarios, but certainly always incredible fiscal challenges where you're trying to do more with less. The infrastructure costs involved with certain kinds of growth are staggeringly high, and we're not paying nearly enough attention to that. And we're all at the same time trying to think about how to keep costs low and services high. So we are literally in a crisis of cities not being able to pay the bills, sometimes even now, and get it and pay for the things they need to get done. But it's just going to get worse in the future as we dig ourselves deeper and deeper into an urban financial hole, if you will. I'm going to talk about something that might be the elephant under the table. Some of you may know that I'm the former chief planner of Vancouver. I've been doing this for 30 years, 6 years of my career. 6 years of that 30 years, I was the chief planner of Vancouver. And I often hear, well, does this guy know that Guelph isn't Vancouver? I'll give you a spoiler. Yes, I know that Guelph isn't Vancouver. I know that most cities aren't Vancouver. I know that no city is exactly alike. And by the way, I'm not from Vancouver. I'm from Perth, Ontario. That's where I was actually born and raised. I live in Vancouver now, but I spent my actual 30 years of my life and the major start of my career planning in Ontario cities, including Guelph. But yes, here is Vancouver. And yes, Vancouver is very different than Guelph. It's taller, it's more dense, it certainly has a different natural setting. And it has a lot of things that, as a mid-sized city in the global standard and a large city in the Canadian standard, it's known for doing very well. And what I say is that cities have to get past their own arrogance to assume that just because a city is different, it doesn't mean you can't learn from it. It doesn't mean you can't be inspired by it. So yes, that's Vancouver's downtown, but this is the rest of Vancouver. It looks a lot more like Guelph now, doesn't it? Because actually the majority of the city and the majority of the region is actually pretty low density and is going through the growing pains of how to grow up versus out, how to densify in a way that still not only achieves sustainability and equity, but also maintains livability. This is also Vancouver. It's old, it's heritage, and it's got a lot of character built into its urbanism in the best parts of it. And so, yes, it also struggles with the issue of preserving heritage. It's got certainly urban nature built into the urban environment and great recreation. It's probably the North American leader, depending on whether you think Montreal or Vancouver holds the title for that in terms of urban biking. But certainly we have the most separated, protected bike infrastructure of any city in North America. It doesn't just do tall buildings. It's known actually for its mid-rise too. It's known for how to do. This is our Olympic Village, which we designed and built for the 2010 Winter Games, which happens to, in the opinion of the U.S. Green Building Council, U.S. Green Building Council, happens to be the greenest city in North America, based at least on LEED ND points, the highest ever given, and the largest and most successful district energy system in North America at a community scale. But Vancouver is known for doing urban design and housing density in particular at every scale, from the highest scales to the lowest scales, ground-oriented homes and housing choices of all types. So if you're thinking Vancouver is different, it isn't necessarily as different as you think, certainly not outside of the downtown. Vancouver's also been struggling with how to achieve additional forms of density. We didn't have a provincial government mandating that you take additional forms of density in your low density neighborhoods. We did it because it's just a good idea in terms of actually providing more flexibility and ability to age in place in our lower density neighborhoods. So I use terms like gentle density, hidden density, and invisible density to talk about how neighborhoods could have more housing choice, actually stabilize their neighborhood in the context of things like keeping their schools open, having walkable shopping, etc. But do it and allow people to downsize from their detached house within their neighborhood and have a place for their kids and grandkids to live, all of which stabilizes your neighborhood instead of this usual narrative that says that neighborhoods are under threat from change, even low density, low rise change. I called it gentle density. My friend Daniel Perolik calls it missing middle housing. It's the same concept. It's the idea of adding more opportunity for housing choice in a way that actually stabilizes neighborhoods rather than destabilizes those. And by the way, if you think might not understand that Vancouver is different, I also spent 6 years planning for the city of Calgary, and it's also very different. If you think your city is conservative, I've heard that some people say that Guelph is a pretty conservative place. Trust me, you're not as conservative as the city of Calgary is. And Calgary is doing has been doing some of the most innovative and progressive things because there's a strong and compelling business case to do that. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk to you about today, because I think Guelph could learn a lot from Calgary in the idea of making the business case for better cities, better urbanism, investing in civic architecture, investing in better urban design and architectural design, all because it actually makes your city more economically successful. And that's one of the conversations I've had with your economic development staff this week. And by the way, it also did the best bike lane pilot, probably in my opinion, ever done in North America in its downtown, where it created a complete bike lane pilot network of the entire downtown almost overnight. And it was so successful, the vote to make it permanent was unanimous in Calgary. And trust me, that's not typical in Calgary with Calgary's council. I also point out that I know that this conversation I'm having with you isn't the same as the conversation I might have with the city of Kingston. Kingston is a city I've been advising for over 4 years now. And I do a great deal of work still, even though I live in Vancouver. I do a great deal of work in Ontario. And Kingston's probably my favorite client because we've been working on some really, really innovative things in a city that is innovative and bold and is definitely punching above its weight in terms of thinking outside the box. But Kingston, in my opinion, has a lot in common. Kingston is a peer, a colleague of Guelph, if you will, in the community of Ontario, small to mid-sized cities. And so I was thinking, as I did this first week with you, I was thinking about my first week with Kingston and the presentation I did for them 4 days into my first week with Kingston. And I actually started it by showing something from their Twitter bio. They actually noted in their Twitter bio that they had passed a council resolution determining that they wanted to become Canada's most sustainable city. I noted for them the fact that they didn't give themselves a deadline, which I thought was pretty cheeky. It's easy to set a goal if you don't give yourself a deadline. But I made the whole conversation that we had that day about what it would really take to achieve not my goal for Kingston, but their goal for themselves, which is what would it really take to become the most sustainable city in Canada? Not only what they would have to do themselves, but also recognizing all the things that those other cities that they were in competition with were doing too. And hopefully those cities were inspiring each other. So I've thought about your context and the thing that you are doing that or have done that is analogous, where your council has shown substantial leadership, is in signing on, if you will, to the race to zero. The idea that you would more than cut in half your per capita climate change causing greenhouse gas emissions by more than cut them in half, drop them by 63% by 2030. And with incremental goals on a council term by council term basis. That's really, really powerful, really important if you meant it. And that's what I'm really stressing, because there are many cities across the world and frankly across Canada that have made such declarations. They've either passed a resolution like this one or declared a climate emergency, or in some cases both. And frankly, to be blunt, they didn't really mean it, but they wanted the political credit for doing it. So I've been careful to look for evidence about what's happening in Guelph with regard to this pretty significant and remarkable commitment. And you notice there's a key element in that, which is that the decision puts climate action at the center of all decision making. That's what your council approved decision actually says. So I've been looking for evidence this week on whether that is happening, because frankly, it's critically important that is happening. So I've been looking at all the various targets, all the various goals. I've been looking at how it breaks down even by term of council. I went back and actually looked at the conversation that happened when that was passed. And I was struck by this comment by a 17-year-old Guelph resident who said, "I'm terrified what this planet will look like. Climate change isn't even about the future anymore. It's right now." And I was inspired by the kind of conversation that was happening when council made this big move. So when I asked Kingston, what would it really take to be the most sustainable city in Canada? I ask you, Guelph, what would it really take to reach a 63% reduction in per capita emissions by 2030? And the answer is a lot, because the climate emergency, uh, I hope I don't need to convince anybody in Guelph. You're a city that sees yourself as a green city. I hope I don't need to convince you of the importance of addressing it, but the amount of actual change that you will need to quickly accommodate, you're probably still significantly underestimating, certainly from a land use planning and transportation perspective. So I asked myself, is Guelph a green city? And then I got information on how you perceive yourself. This is from your recent survey that you did. I don't know if you can see that third line, but 90% of Guelph respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that Guelph is an environmentally responsible city. It matters to me how you think about yourself. I asked a lot of people the question, does Guelph really consider itself a green city? And does Guelph want to be a green city? And this certainly tells me you see yourself as a green city and you want to be a green city. If I were answering this question based on my observations this week, I would probably answer it with a category that isn't on this survey. I would probably check the box that says somewhat agree, but I wouldn't agree or strongly agree that you are an environmentally responsible city. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. Because this to me is the real question. Is Guelph, not is Guelph green, but is Guelph as green as it needs to be at this stage with everything we know about the climate crisis? As an example, I pointed out to your council this week and your staff that at the time, two to 2.5 years ago, that you started your official plan process. At that point, well, 2.5 years ago, even since then, just a couple of months ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released by far its most aggressive report with the most urgent language I've ever seen from that body. And climate scientists are not used to using really strong language, frankly. The strongest language I've ever seen in that report, and the most specific about the need for cities to change, how critically important how cities are planned and designed and built has to do with avoiding the worst consequences of the climate emergency. So when I think about, is Guelph as green as it needs to be, I look at things like your Race to Zero goals. I try to get a sense of whether your targets will actually get you there and whether your actions will actually really get you there or not. And if some of your actions are actually counterproductive to your ability to achieve that goal. And at the risk of being overly simplistic, one of the ways I've looked at this quickly this week is I've tried to get a handle on how does Guelph handle your density, your trees, and your cars. Because if I could only focus on a few subject matters, frankly, how you answer these three issues, how you address these three issues tells me a lot about whether or not you're actually green. And I'm going to get the trees part out of the way because I think the trees part you're doing pretty well at least by comparison to other cities, if that's your definition of success. Because frankly, I think most cities are not doing a great job with their urban tree canopy. But I probably don't need to tell you that this is a place of particular strength for you. And that's important because whether you are a so-called tree person or not, pragmatically speaking, there are very few things that are more of a no-brainer for cities because of all the things, all the public benefits and all the cost savings that a good tree canopy actually produce. There's very few things that are more of a no-brainer than trees, and yet we tend to treat them as this kind of thing that certain advocacy groups fight for, but it's not a really pragmatic thing. It's incredibly pragmatic from the perspective of cost savings and a lot of your public goals to address trees. And I say this not as a tree person per se, but as a good city planner who understands what actually makes cities work better and be more successful. And if we're going to talk about cars, I want to say this up front, because this is too often the elephant under the table in my conversations, certainly with councillors often, and mayors even, but sometimes even with staff. Not that this was said by your staff, by the way, or your mayor and council. But the bad news is electric cars aren't going to save us, and self-driving cars aren't going to save us if they ever actually arrive. The bad news is the technology isn't going to save us if we don't address the fundamentals of better city making. And I said this in Wired magazine, new technology can be advantageous, but it doesn't replace compact, walkable, complete communities with a good relationship between housing and employment. That is what will address climate emergency. By the way, it will also address the public health emergency, the housing emergency, the equity emergency, etc. So don't think you can sit there and wait for a better car. What you need to be planning are better cities and better communities, and frankly, fewer cars and less driving. But at the same time, because cars will still be with us, we also want better cars too. But that's not the primary solution here. So when I'm thinking about these 5 crises, I want to talk about some of the other ones because I've been talking about climate change. Just quickly, I want to talk about this public health thing. It's actually pretty powerful when Ontario doctors, which I certainly took note of even from here in Vancouver, are out there talking about how more walking, cycling, and use of public transit, more compact communities, more mixed-use compact communities is absolutely critical to the prevention of chronic disease, etc. And when this first came out, I said, holy cow, the 3 public health officials of 3 regions in the GTA held a press conference, and on the whole media came. I think if 3 chief planners called a press conference, the media probably wouldn't come. But we listen in the context of our public health officials. And this was, of course, even before the pandemic. So it's incredibly important that the public health conversation is being very overtly connected to the need for more density, more mixed use, more walkable, biking, and transit-friendly communities. I know this also from one of my other clients. One of my clients is the Heart Foundation of Australia, certainly one of my past clients. And they actually hired me to come and work with 5 different regions and state level governments in Australia to talk about how to basically integrate urban health thinking into our city and regional planning. And this is a document that they did called Does Density Matter? The Role of Density in Creating Walkable Neighborhoods. You can download this document. It's very good, but I'm going to spoil it for you and give away the ending. Density does matter. When you do density well, it's critically important for so many things, including urban health. So now let's talk about money. If all you're motivated about is money, it's staggering when the math is actually revealed about the differences between growing up versus growing out and its implications to your fiscal, economic health of your city, and whether or not you pay more taxes, and whether or not you get more services for the taxes you actually are paying. And for example, actually, Canada is one of the leaders in the world at doing this kind of math about the costs of growth and particularly the costs of sprawl. And as an example, Halifax regional metropolitan area did one of the biggest studies that determined that just toggling the amount of growth between infill versus greenfields, in other words, up versus out, over the life of a city plan made a difference of $3 billion of municipal infrastructure. And for a city the size of Halifax, $3 billion is an awful lot. And that was just a small adjustment in terms of how much growth goes to infill versus to greenfields or to new suburbs, new sprawl. So a lot is happening in the transformation of the conversation about cities and suburbs, not because of an ideology, an urbanist ideology about better cities, but because of better math. We're actually doing the math, the financial math, on the cost of growth, and more specifically, what kind of growth costs a lot more, and what kind of growth actually subsidizes the other forms of housing. Your city has actually done some good work. Guelph's done some really good work by engaging consultants to actually show where the revenue comes from in your city relative to where the costs are. And guess what? Over time, but certainly by 2019, this is the result. Your downtown and your urban places, your most urban places, are your economic engines. And they are subsidizing the other forms of housing. They're subsidizing the other neighborhoods and helping to keep the taxes low in those other neighborhoods. Yet, ironically, those other neighborhoods often object to density, even density or investment going into the downtown, even though it's literally that kind of development in places like downtown and urban settings that's allowing the taxes to be kept relatively low for low density areas. That kind of math, that kind of information is staggeringly important. We know it, but we don't talk about it enough. And it doesn't become the basis of our conversation on every single time we talk about growth, every single time we talk about density, every single time about how our city is actually going to grow. So if you're motivated by keeping your tax low, your service is good, you should care about the fact that the downtown remains and actually grows as your economic engine. And you should care that the urban parts of your suburbs that are going to urbanize, the centers and corridors in your official plan that are going to urbanize, that they urbanize successfully, because that actual density that sometimes many of you actually might want to fight against is actually going to be the key to your financial health as a city and you individually too. Uh-oh. I also looked at what kind of housing you've been building. And I like the fact I see since 2006 all the way to 2021 and projecting forward that you're building a lot more of other types of housing, and that's a good thing. But I noticed when I studied this analysis closely that movement towards other forms of housing is continuing, but it's kind of slowing down. So one of the things I've said to your staff is that I think you need a conversation about how to make sure you're continuing to build other forms of housing and keeping going in terms of moving towards diversity and more equity. This kind of missing middle housing that we're talking about. And I looked at your goals and your actual achievements around where your growth is going, because you've targeted about a little less than half of your growth to be infill and a little more than half your growth to be greenfields. And I've looked at how it plays out over the course of year by year. And trust me, I'm not going to go through this chart. I know some of you are thinking, oh my God, a bar chart, it's going to make my eyes bleed. I hate these things too. But what they actually tell us is whether we're succeeding or not in keeping up with our goals around infill housing particularly. And again, what this showed me is you've been slowing down lately, recently, in terms of achieving more of the infill housing in the infill locations. And that's something you should pay attention to. When we're having this conversation about the types of housing in different parts of Guelph, I want to be really clear. We're not even talking about mid-rise housing in most places, let alone tall buildings. We're talking about what I call gentle, hidden, and invisible density, the kind of housing that's still ground-oriented, it's human-scaled, it's scaled similar to, frankly, to that of a detached house. You're doing a lot, and you're proposing a lot in this kind of a housing in the context of your new zoning bylaw and your new official plan, in many cases because the province is mandating you to. But I think you should actually be leaning in on this, that this kind of housing is good for many of the reasons that I've talked about in actually stabilizing neighborhoods and allowing them to stay healthy and great places to age in place. And so the conversation about change in the so-called low-density neighborhoods needs to transform. In Vancouver, I brought in the Laneway Housing Initiative, which was 10 years plus before separated ADUs, accessory dwelling units, were mandated by your provincial government. Vancouver has over 5,000 of them already approved, and they're very successful. I called it hidden density because they're tucked in behind and they don't change the nature of the character of your street or your community from the street edge, because you almost don't know it's there. It's hidden density. So there's all sorts of ways you can be embracing these various types of housing forms, different scales of housing. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but in every scale, do you have a high expectation around architecture and urban design to make sure that these building types of every scale are strengthening the street, strengthening the neighborhood, etc. And in your downtown, what I will say is, one of the big debates, of course, in downtown, I don't need to tell you, is tall buildings in the downtown. And I'm not going to tell you you fundamentally need more tall buildings in your downtown, because I think there could be other solutions for you. But I will say this. You put a lot of emphasis on a specific measurement like the geodetic of your church, when I can tell you from the perspective of the work I've done, you could achieve more density and even more height in your downtown without in any way undermining the primacy of your church as an architectural statement in your downtown. You could do more in your downtown than you're doing, but I'm not necessarily going to recommend to you that you need to do that. What I will say is that I think you could be doing more around your downtown. You tend to be having the conversation about what I call body heat, more housing, more job space, the things that bring people to the downtown. You tend to have that conversation in the context of what you would call the downtown proper, the area specifically accommodated by your downtown secondary plan. I think there's another ring around it that you should be thinking about that's walkable to the downtown. The housing that supports your downtown can be a 10-minute, a 15-minute, a 20-minute walking distance from your downtown. And that creates additional body heat that's going to help keep your downtown strong and strengthen your downtown. And that was important before the pandemic, but downtowns are under major threat coming out of the pandemic. So it should really matter to you that your downtown remains strong and get even stronger, not least of which is because of the economic information I provided to you earlier. But let's talk about tall buildings. I often talk about what I call the Montparnasse effect. This is the Montparnasse Tower in Paris. And it was so hated that it literally it was the first tall tower done in historic Paris ever. And it was so hated because it was so awful that literally Paris said no more tall buildings. And that remained in place until they planned a specific place for tall buildings, which is La Défense, if you know that area of Paris. But I like to talk about this as an example of why we need to do our tall buildings much better, or else obviously people are going to hate them. And frankly, if we're going to do tall buildings, and once we decide where we're going to do tall buildings, we have to do them much better than, frankly, many cities do. So I often talk about what I call the dogma of height. That we get far too dogmatic about tall buildings being inherently bad and shorter buildings being inherently good. I can tell you that there are badly designed shorter buildings and extremely well designed taller buildings. What matters to me is the quality of the design, the locational decisions about where and where not tall buildings should be, and then how well they are designed. And frankly, we should have a much higher standard in terms of how well we design are tall buildings. And of course, I was chief planner of Vancouver. Vancouver regulates tall buildings more than any other city on the planet. I can guarantee you that. Particularly how the buildings land. They land in the context of a human scale, either a 2 or 3 story townhouse up to a 5 or 6 story mid-rise. Then the towers are separated by rules. They're stepped back. My predecessor, Larry Beasley, always said they float out of the perception of the walkers. So the walker's experience is a human scaled experience created by the podium. And then the towers create the body heat, additional population, where you can ride down the elevator, which is a form of public transit, and interact with your street, walk to school, walk to the grocery store. That is vertical urbanism. And so much attention has to go to creating that positive experience for the pedestrian at grade, where when you're walking to it, you wouldn't even necessarily know that these pictures that I have in these photos are at the base of a tower, because this is the experience that you experience at eye level at 5 kilometers an hour, which is how the pedestrian lives. And whether it's retail space or residential space, you're just constantly paying attention to the quality of that experience. New York City has broken up that experience significantly in terms of all the elements of it. I say that's way too complicated. What we did in Vancouver was basically say, rule 1, no blank walls. Always have something visually interesting, permeable, interactive with the street. And the rest of the details you will work out. But just remember that rule, no blank walls. And try to make your streets what I call sticky streets, that where uses are actually spilling out on them and engaging the street. This is the kind of street, not where engineers want the pedestrians to move as quickly as possible for the purposes of pedestrian traffic counts. This is a street that actually defines success by slowing people down and encouraging them to stay. That's what I mean by sticky, by the way. I don't mean there's gum on the street. But there are folks out there that say that any tall building is vertical sprawl. That's just fundamentally wrong. And I'll tell you the difference between vertical sprawl and vertical urbanism. Vertical sprawl is tall buildings in the wrong place, oriented way back from the street, in a car-dependent context with a car-dependent design. So you ride down the elevator, go down to your parking garage and vomit out onto the expressway. Whereas vertical urbanism is you ride down that elevator and interact with your street and neighborhood and block and community. Height isn't inherently green. Let's be clear on this. Height can actually have problems in and of itself, especially when it's very tall. From the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions. But height can and should enable more density, and more density is inherently green. And so this is a conversation about using height as a way to achieve more density, not instead of other ways of doing density. I talk a lot about the magic of how to do density well, because I'm not a fan of bad density. I'm not a fan of lazy density. I think the more our density increases, the more our expectations and responsibilities are to design and do that density successfully. And I break it all down in terms of what I mean by that. But what I'll say kind of very generally is I'll quote one of my heroes, Jonathan Barnett. It's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. What I actually say is it's both. It does matter how dense you make it, but it really matters how you make it dense. And then I'll riff on that and say when it comes to the height part of that conversation, which is often the more controversial part of that conversation, how tall a building is, it's not just how tall you make it, but how you make it tall. And so I provide cities with breakdowns of all the ways that you address the design of tall buildings. And by the way, you'll see, and I don't know, it's bullet number 5 or 6 or 7, that's where I mention the height. Here's the problem. Too many cities are having a one-dimensional conversation about tall buildings. And it starts and ends with, how many floors does the building have? Well, that's too many floors, so it's a bad building. I have peer-reviewed and investigated designs of buildings, in many cases tall buildings, and have said, I can tell you 10 things wrong with the building before I even mention how tall it is. We are focusing entirely too much just on height. We're not concentrating on how to design tall buildings well. For example, it might surprise you. You can look at the image down at the bottom in this montage, that when you're on this sidewalk, looking at not just a double, but a triple row of trees. This is one of my kids' favorite streets that we walk along regularly, that you're actually at the base of base of multiple towers and a podium mid-rise. You can do tall buildings well that in a way that actually creates human scale. You just have to design for it. But here's the problem. As we're urbanizing parts of the suburbs, which is something you absolutely have to do, we're doing a bad job of it because we're not addressing what I call the 3 fundamental challenges: the challenge of scale, mix, and place. The scale is still scaled to the car instead of scaled to people. So this is, you may know this is an older image. I haven't updated it in a while of so-called downtown Mississauga. Scaled to the car, not a good place to walk if you're a pedestrian. Technically, the sidewalks are there, but the distance between everything is so far as a pedestrian because it's scaled to the car. The mix is only on paper. Technically, you've got housing over there. Yes, it's there. You've got office over here. You've got shopping over there, but it's all separated. It's not mixed and integrated. And there's no place there. There's no there. There's nothing to make it special, although some of the architecture is quite distinctive. So if you're going to try to urbanize corridors, which you are doing in Guelph, and urbanize centers, former big box power centers and shopping malls, etc., and urbanize them into real urban mixed use places, you have to address these 3 issues of scale, mix, and place. You have to design urban conditions, not just a higher density, taller suburb, which frankly, a lot of these downtowns are. This may look high density, but this is suburban because it's car dependent. This is important because a lot of malls, a lot of former malls, and next up is going to be former power centers, are going to be transforming in the context of mixed-use urbanism. It's a massive trend in North America. What I see in cities that I'm advising in Ontario is if you haven't seen it this year, there's a good chance you're going to see it next year. That's how fast it's starting to happen. And so a lot of cities are coming to Vancouver to study how we've been doing transit-oriented development. Most of these projects, these communities we're building, are former shopping malls that are now on public transit, some form of public transit. And having a conversation about how to do taller buildings in these contexts and not saying we want to limit the height is very, very important, because in many cases, these projects simply aren't viable without the greater density that the height provides. So what I've said is I think Guelph has to get over its fear of heights, particularly outside the downtown area, because as you urbanize your cores and former centers, you're going to be transforming them into real urban places. And height is going to be one of the tools in your toolkit. And you are artificially limiting your potential for success by still being just fundamentally concerned and afraid of taller buildings. And yes, you've got all the rest of the suburban sprawl. I know this isn't Guelph, and your suburbs are much better than this. But this is still the truth. The success or failure of our cities will ultimately depend on how well we do our suburbs. And not all suburbia is sprawl, but far too much of it is. And we're still approving sprawl. And if you want a really simple definition of sprawl, it's car dependency. There's no reason why we have to be building our suburbs to be car dependent, but we are. We're still doing it, and we're doing it at a rapid pace. And any city that's still rapidly approving sprawl cannot call itself green, because this is, it's a cartoon, but it's a cartoon that plays on reality. I'm gonna start speeding up a bit because I want to get to some of my key recommendations. Let's talk about transportation. The land use transportation conversation is absolutely critical. This is something I've been talking about all week with your staff. And for those of you who support walking, biking, and public transit, you also have to support higher density and mixed land use. Because as we often say for decades now in Vancouver, the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. In other words, if you get your density and your mix right, you get your mode shift. The mode shift, we've got the best mode shift of any city in North America in Vancouver, shifting from car use to walking, biking, and transit. And that is actually a success of land use first. Our engineers even acknowledge that. And then infrastructure second. You need both, but the land use is the critical piece, because if not, you've got great infrastructure connecting nothing and nothing out in the middle of nowhere because your density and your land use just isn't there. So in Vancouver and in many, many more cities now, and I've advised many cities in how to create this, the key is not to balance ways of getting around. You are prioritizing cars still and too much. And the answer isn't to switch to balance, because balance is often code for the status quo, only slightly better. You need to now prioritize. If you take your goal seriously relative to climate emissions, you need to prioritize walking, biking, and transit, then goods movement, and then the car. I'm not a fan of banning the car, but I do say we have to prioritize it last until all those other modes catch up. And frankly, you get the mode shift you need to get to where you need to be for emission reduction. This was a very old, I've been using this drawing for over 15 years now, and you can see by how old some of those vehicles are, and the fact that, horribly, I don't have a wheelchair in the first image. These are the ones where, of course, we're doing now, where much better images. And that one's even in Spanish when I worked with the city of Medellin, Colombia, where we integrated it into the policy and in both land use and transportation. Absolutely critical. You will not get anywhere near where you need to be as long as you continue to prioritize cars. And you will also not get there if you are going to try to talk about balance. You need to prioritize walking, biking, and public transit. And if you think that's an anti-car message, it's not. What I say is if you design a city primarily for cars, it actually fails for everyone, including drivers. If you design a multimodal city, it works better for everyone, including drivers. Because if everyone's driving, nobody's moving. So I'm going to skip past this. Bike lanes are something that I've had a good conversation with your staff around. The key is to get away from any conversation about paint, whether it be sharrows or painted bike lanes. The only thing that works in terms of bike mode share shift to biking is separated protected bike lanes. And you have to design them well for 8 to 80 or AAA, all ages and abilities. So I've looked at your plans relative to your goals around a bike network, and I think it looks pretty good, but I've got some comments on that. This is how we got to that bike mode shift in Vancouver. This is how Calgary did it in that pilot I told you about. The problem is we've got to reprioritize space. If you think you can get to bike mode share without taking away space for cars, you're dreaming. Because right now the cars are taking up most of the space. I love this old cartoon. Here's the version from the pandemic, where frankly cars got even more space. But this is not an anti-car message, because the more people moving in that less amount of space for walking, biking, and transit, ironically, that's fewer people needing to drive. So this is better for everyone, including drivers. And we've got to think fundamentally differently about the way we do parking, because right now we are over providing for parking. We're letting parking being the thing that frankly just fundamentally limits our ability to achieve many of our public goals. It will certainly limit your ability to achieve your climate emissions goals. I want you to take a look at what we did in Kingston on a piece of work we called The Power of Parking, because we fundamentally changed the conversation about parking, all the implications around the real parking problem. And in a city that's just as conservative as yours, that often talks about how it's averse to change, that's how Kingston sees itself. We have one of the most progressive new car parking and bike parking approaches in the new zoning bylaw that wasn't appealed to the tribunal, by the way. And you actually had American publications saying to their cities, steal this idea, which is probably one of my favorite titles ever, Steal This Idea. But listen, change is never easy. Certainly change relative to heightened density is never easy. Even the slightest changes can be controversial. This is a poster that an opposition group, community group did in Calgary, or in Vancouver, sorry, where the heights of a main transit corridor were being proposed to change from just 40 feet to 50 feet, 10 feet more. And this was the poster that the opposition created. So if you think change is easy in a city like Vancouver, it isn't. Frankly, the opposition groups that don't like change are frankly probably more sophisticated than in most cities. But what I like to do is shift the conversation not from NIMBY or YIMBY, which is not in my backyard versus yes in my backyard, to a conversation about QUIMBY, which is quality in my backyard. How do we get quality outcomes consistently delivered? And while we're doing all of that, we've got to be doing the temporary city better, or the immediate city, because in the meantime, there's a lot of things we can change really quickly. And boy, we knew that before the pandemic, but we really know it now in the context of what we learned during the pandemic. Cities like Santiago, Auckland, New Zealand, food trucks and food carts being used in cities like Halifax and Portland. Shipping containers, which is a conversation in your zoning bylaw, being used in cities like Christchurch after the earthquake, and Halifax, and Oslo, and New York City, and Helsinki. And this is a corner in Brisbane, Australia, where I've advised. And the transformation of streets with parklets and streeteries and abilities to eat and engage with the public and your fellow citizens in the public realm in the city. And you did a lot of good things in this during the pandemic. The shame of it is you need to be talking about making those transformations permanent, because they actually were needed before the pandemic, frankly, not just during the pandemic. But the pandemic did change a lot of our conversations about city making. We learned a lot about sidewalk widths and street design and opening streets to people instead of cars. And we needed to take that opportunity to actually limit the amount of cars that would come back. And frankly, not all of our cities did a good job at that. But I was inspired by one of my client cities, Dublin, Ireland, who said this: things that seemed unimaginable and unattainable until very recently are suddenly just happening in Dublin city streets. And they made the good decision to make many of those things permanent. So I'm going a bit long, but I'm going to go quickly through my observations and recommendations for you at the end. So some observations. First of all, Guelph, you have good staff and you're doing good planning. And I'm not saying that to be patronizing, because I wouldn't say it if I didn't think it was true. And that's good, because a lot of cities, frankly, in Ontario, I wouldn't necessarily say that about. Your policy and your data, you've got especially good data to educate better conversations and decisions, is in really good shape, much better than many other cities. You've got a really smart conversation and work processes going on, combining city planning and land economics, land development economics and economic development, recognizing that good city making is good for the economic development of the city. But here's where we start to get a little more critical. You're green, but you're not as green as you think you are. Your actions and your targets will not get you to 63% less emissions per capita by 2030. I'm not even sure they will get you there by 2050. You're not going far enough, fast enough. That's my major conclusion for you. So you're not going to achieve what you've promised you would achieve. And I don't want you to wait until 2030 to announce you failed. I want you to recognize that you fundamentally need to change your goals and targets and actions right now in order to succeed in 2030. So here's my advice and my recommendations. You need to go further faster. My primary message to you. You are doing good things, and that's good because many other cities out there are not necessarily doing good things. You're doing good things, but you need to go further and faster. You need to change your conversations about city making because I'm still hearing a lot of evidence of conversations you're having, debates you're having about change in your city that are based on false premises, wrong information, not connecting the dots between individual actions and something like climate change. You need to use your data and evidence and math better. You've been collecting better data than most other cities out there, but you're not using it effectively to educate the public and educate the conversations about why we do need to change, why we need more infill compared to greenfields, why we need to think about more density and yes, even more height. You need to rethink what you can afford. Too many times this week I've heard, we'd like to do more, but we can't afford it. That's because you're thinking about things like planting trees and building bike lanes like a cost instead of an investment. You need to be embracing the idea of cost savings, not just cost, return on investment. You need to be looking at every expenditure you make in the context of actually saving money and making money, not just costing money. And when you do that, you will actually have the inevitable conclusion that you should be planting trees and building bike lanes faster. And this gives me a chance to remind you of a key thing I say to many cities. The truth about a city's aspiration isn't found in its vision, it's found in its budget. So where you put your money, how you're allocating strategically, and how fast you're prioritizing certain things, that's the key to success. I don't think you're doing a budget that's geared towards 63% reductions by 2030. Make the business case better for the things you want to do. There is a remarkably powerful business case for more bike lanes, more density, better public realm design, investing in the downtown, reconsidering car dominance and dependency in the suburbs and even downtown, investing in bike lanes, etc. The business case is there. You need to be better at making it, frankly, because all the evidence and all the data is on the side of those issues. You need to do what you promised you would do in the council approval. Review everything you do against that 2030 goal or that 63% by 2030. And you need to tell the truth about things that sometimes directly contravene it, because you are doing things right now that are actually making the achievement of that harder, and you're not talking about that. You need to talk about that, and you need to tell the truth. Your new official plan and your new zoning bylaw, even though they're getting close to the end, it is not too late for them to think bigger and be bolder, because they frankly need to be. The official plan and zoning bylaw that you are working on right now does not go far enough to address what you say you want to achieve in the context of the climate emergency and the race to zero. You need more infill and less sprawl. You need to continue fast to change that relationship of infill. You're doing about 50% on average infill in terms of your growth. It probably needs to be at least 60% or more. So you need to be making infill easier, because right now, ironically, we want more infill. We're worried about sprawl. And yet I guarantee you, your rules, your processes, your policies, your marketing even, all make sprawl easier than infill. And you need to reverse that. You need more body heat in your downtown. And I'm not necessarily talking about tall towers, taller towers or more tall towers, although you could do that and still keep the primacy of your church. But what I'm actually talking about is a greater geographic area around your downtown that has more mid-rise density that can provide body heat for the downtown. But outside the downtown, you need to get past your fear of heights. In your centers and along your corridors, there is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be going taller. And by that, I mean more dense, with height being a way to facilitate that. In those centers and corridors, you need to really urbanize those parts of your suburbs faster and better. You need to not be building high-density suburbs. You need to be building real urban places. And in the lower density communities, I think you can go further in the context of gentle density than the province is mandating that you do. If all you're doing as a green and equitable city is how much this particular provincial government is making you do, then you're not really leaning in to the concept of housing diversity, equity, aging in place, etc. You should consider legalizing and even mandating the corner store and other things to walk to when you're doing your zoning bylaw, because frankly, the zoning in most cities has made those things illegal. You need to make them legal as part of what's called a 15-minute community, a more walkable community that you actually have things to walk to. You should speed up your investment in street trees. You're doing it very well, but your own goals say you could be going faster, but it's your perception that you don't have the money for it that's keeping you from doing even more in the context of your tree canopy. And you should reject this notion that achieving more trees and achieving more density are fundamentally at odds. They are not. I'm doing a whole talk on that with Gil Penalosa next Tuesday morning if you want to hear more about that. You need to stop prioritizing cars, and you are still doing that right now. You need to speed up your transportation mode shift so you can get to walking, biking, and transit as a higher percentage of your overall trips faster than you have set your goals for, because your goals won't get you to a 63% drop. You are an ideal biking city based on your scale, the actual distance between things. You've got hills, yes, but e-bikes help address that, as do other things. You need to make it happen faster. You could lean on being a bike city, and you could be an inspiration on fast transformation. And you've got the plans in place, but you've got timeframes that are too long and too slow. You need to probably double your speed. The things you plan to do in 10 years, you should be doing in 5 at the most. Make the case for your bus-only lanes and do them fast. You were talking about frequent bus transit, and that's a good thing. But if your frequent buses are still stuck in the same traffic as your cars, you're not going to get enough mode shift to buses. So you need to convert that lane next to the curb to bus-only lanes. You need to run frequent buses on it. You need to make the business case for it so that when the people complain, you've educated them on everything that does, including help make the city work better for cars. And then you need to do it boldly and quickly. You need to transform your approach to parking, as I've talked about. Lower significantly, more than you're thinking of doing, lower significantly your parking minimums, establish a parking maximum, and change this idea of mandated, city hall mandated excessive parking. And by the way, this is not going to make your downtown business association happy, but you do not need more parking downtown. I've heard the stat that at any given time in the downtown, there are 300 empty available parking spaces. You do not need more parking downtown. But the problem is, in your zeal to try to create more parking downtown, you're actually going to do damage to your downtown. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. Take those things you did during the pandemic that your people loved and make them permanent. Other cities in the world have done that. The cities that won during the pandemic are the cities that did the things that they knew they had to do anyway for pollution and quality of life, etc. And they planned to make them permanent from day one, or they decided to make them permanent after. I think it would be a real shame if you took all those, more than a real shame. It would be wrong to take the successful things you did during the pandemic and not make them permanent. Listen, I know change is never easy. It's never easy. And everything I've said today is hard because I've sat in the chair of your chief planner, and I've sat in the positions of your staff, and I've worked with your politicians of every possible stripe around the world. I know this isn't easy. I know this is hard, but you have to figure out ways to succeed better. And hopefully what I've tried to do today is give you some help in terms of how to think about your shared problems in a way that can help you have a different conversation. But fundamentally, you're going to need different decisions. And I actually talk about what I call the sixth crisis, which is a leadership crisis, because too many cities know what they have to do, but are just worried about it not being popular. They're not able to make the case to the community. And so they're not doing it. I'm not saying that's what Guelph does. Actually, Guelph, I think, is better than average on this, but I think you can get better and go further in this area. And I think you can fundamentally make Guelph inspiring, not just to mid-sized cities like Kingston has been doing, but to cities of any size. I want Guelph to be known as one of those cities that punches above its weight in terms of incredible innovation around sustainability and city making. I honestly believe Guelph has that potential. Krista, I'm done. I know I went a bit long, but thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Brent. We covered a lot of information in a very short period of time, but it is to your last slide, very inspiring for staff and hopefully for the community, and certainly from the comments that we've got in, there's been a lot of positive feedback. So I'm going to start with a few questions, but I'm actually going to start with one first. Um, so you definitely gave an honest review of where things are at, and we knew that was the terms going into this. But you shared we need to get better faster. You know, as Guelph's planners and transportation engineers, energy managers, parks planners, we've been talking a lot about being bold. We have new mode share targets as of this year. We're coming forward with our draft zoning bylaw to get rid of exclusionary zoning and change parking minimums and adding maximums. We've just released our race to zero interim targets for 2026. So we won't get to 2030 before we have a check-in. So that is good news.
That's
Um,
true.
and you know, Guelph is changing, and to use your words, we need to go faster. So how important is it that we really lean into this? And as you note, how that we communicate this better?
Well, it's events like this are important because the biggest problem with going faster is the community understanding why. And change is hard and scary, and fast change particularly so. So, city halls have this remarkable problem and challenge of knowing they need to go faster, but struggling with the idea of how to do that successfully in the context of the public not necessarily, and even sometimes city councilors and staff not necessarily fully understanding how all these dots connect. The idea that fundamentally changing the way you do parking is absolutely critical to whether you achieve 63% per capita emissions. But the dots aren't always so obvious to connect. So, one of my observations over my career has been it's the easy part is to know the right things to do. The hard part is to be much better at communication, much better at making the case for why we have to do this, why the status quo isn't working, even though on its face it seems to be working fine, and that a lot of people like Guelph exactly the way it is and would hope that it actually won't change. But it's not even working well for everyone right now. It's working for some, but not everyone. And it's certainly not going to be working well in the future as the consequences of these things, frankly, pick up speed and get worse and worse and worse. So that's all an incredibly hard conversation to have. And so much of my work certainly is about helping cities change that conversation. Because boy, if all we do is go out and in the context of development applications and new plans and say, we're wanting to do a new plan, what do you think? And I'm not saying that's what Guelph does, but frankly, some cities do that. And then they got bowled over with commentary that says basically, no, thank you. We like our community exactly the way that it is. Staff know that doesn't work relative to the climate emergency and such, so they recommend something else. And then the community says, what? You didn't listen. That's not what we told you. So the ability to have this profound and blunt conversation and really candid conversation is so incredibly important. And it takes a lot of bravery.
Right. Thank you. So one of the questions was sent in that at the planning event that we mentioned that happened in 2020, it was an in-person event, and a lot of people attended in person, and they applauded the idea of car-free portions of the town. And then most people left the venue in their cars, in their own
Yeah.
private automobile, despite the fact that they were within a 5-minute walk of different transportation options. How do we get more people out of their cars?
Well, first of all, if you were serious with the specifics of your language, one of the problems is we tend to have conversations about things like car free, which frankly sounds really scary to a lot of people. Car free, don't they know I need my car? It, are you going to try to force me out of my car? So I think we've got to be really careful and specific. And I'm not picking on your choice of words. That language probably was used a bit back then by some folks. But what I say is we don't need car free. We don't need to ban the car. And it actually works better for everyone if there are alternatives to the car. Because I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a room of citizens and somebody says, but don't you understand I need my car for this, that, or the other thing? And there's some planners out there that would try to argue with that person and say, no, you don't really need the car. Look, I can show you how you can do that on your bike. I don't do that. What I say is, you may need your car or just want your car, but it's in your best interest that the neighbor beside you rides their bike and the neighbor behind you takes transit and the neighbor to the other side of you walks. Because if they're all in their cars in front of you, you're not moving as well. And it actually makes it easier for the people who do need to drive or just want to drive when walking, biking, and public transit is inviting to a lot of other people. To me, that's the real conversation. This narrative of the war on the car is just complete and utter, to use a technical planning term, bullshit. And it's been manufactured to kind of polarize the conversation. And it's very successful at that. But the truth, I always know if anyone uses the term war in the car, they're either doing it on purpose to make people mad, or they just don't fundamentally understand how cities actually work. And how cities actually work are bound by the rules of things like geometry, where if everyone's trying to drive a car, nobody moves. So I think we need to change the conversation about some of these things. Whether that means that person is going to realize, gee, short trips, I don't need my car. Short trips are the easiest thing for us to transform to a walk or a bike trip. And transit usually is a way to go further distances. But it starts with the city making those options inviting and even enjoyable. That's part of it. It won't happen until that happens. But it's also going to be recognized. I think once we've gone far enough in that conversation, what I've seen is people start to just come to that conclusion themselves. Why am I driving? It's actually a nice walk, but they won't necessarily do that on a cold, snowy day. So it's to me, it always starts with a fundamentally different way to have the conversation, and I think often we city planners don't do a good job of that.
I would agree, and ensuring that we have active, accessible, and easy options for choice
Mm.
is a key to going forward. So one of the questions that came in is um, the active transportation infrastructure. Should we be designating it as essential infrastructure in our official plan?
Oh, you have to explain to me what the difference is. What are the implications of calling it essential? Is that a prioritization for budget?
It would be a prioritization in the hierarchy of transportation options. Yes.
Oh, well, if that's a way to prioritize in the way that I've said to you, you should prioritize, my obvious answer is yes. There's other mechanisms that other cities use to prioritize. Frankly, all you need to do is create a policy in your transportation plan, in your official plan, that says we're not going to balance, we're going to prioritize. Here it is. It's actually the easy part. The hard part is making it true in the context of having it actually be reflected in all your decisions, including your budget. But if in your particular system, prioritizing it as essential infrastructure is the way to get it prioritized, then absolutely. And you're not even lying. Of course it's essential. You cannot get to 63% reduction per capita by 2030 without significant mode shift, and you can't get to significant mode shift without fast tracking the kind of infrastructure that will achieve mode shift. Period, full stop. Everything else is just not true.
All right. So another question that came in is wanted to ask a question about exclusionary zoning and zoning reform. Is there any other way to avoid the downtown having all tall luxury condos versus having areas rezoned for the mixed low mid-rise zoning to build gentle density? It feels it's always at the end of the spectrum.
Okay, I'm not sure I followed that. So you've got taller buildings in the downtown, and then, sorry, that seemed like an either or that wasn't quite, that didn't quite click with me. Can you try that one again?
Sure, and I'm reading them as they come in. So
Okay.
I wanted to ask a question about zoning and exclusionary zoning and zoning reform. Is there any other way to avoid the downtown making the tall luxury condos versus having the area rezoned for the mixed low and mid-rise zoning to build gentle density?
Okay. And I
Feels like
presume
it's
what that
always ended this
person
mixed
means.
spectrum. And maybe I'll just before we start, we do have the downtown height and density schedule where
Yeah.
we have the higher densities at the lower elevations, and then we do have a gradual height increase up to the main streets of the downtown. So I think maybe that's where they're talking a little bit, but certainly some concerns are being voiced here about the condos being built versus a lower rised
Well,
downtown.
typically, my understanding is you can do tall buildings downtown at the lower geodetic, and it goes up from there. So there are tall buildings allowed. I've said that I thought you could do more tall buildings without impacting your fundamental goal, which is to hurt the primacy of the church's dominance in the skyline in an artful way. But as I said, that's not that important to me. Whether or not the tall building has quote unquote luxury towers is sort of a separate question, because you can have tall buildings with rental housing in it. You can have tall buildings with modest market. If you want a conversation about the type of housing that's being built as opposed to the height of the buildings that are being built, that's a separate conversation. And there are techniques that you can use, that the city can use, to talk about inclusionary zoning, affordability, etc. But that's how we tend to put the narrative out there, right? Towers are always filled with luxury condos. Well, they might be or they might not be. It could be rental housing. It could be any level in the affordability spectrum. The point about the gentle density, I actually think the answer is both. I don't think it's either or. I think you use height to achieve density in actual homes for people, where it works, where it makes sense. And if anyone thinks I'm just a booster for tall buildings, I've probably said no to tall buildings more than I've said yes, because they're a good place to put them, good places to put them, and bad places to put them for various reasons. But I think a combination of tall buildings in the right places with the right height and excellent design. I think mid-rise in strategic locations, and yes, gentle density, and a lot more mid-rise, as I said, around the downtown, that's in walkable distance to the downtown to help strengthen the downtown with that additional body heat. All of those should be on the table. I don't think it's either or. A sophisticated city isn't dogmatic or lazy intellectually about this issue of height. It thinks about where and where not, all of the above, and how to make sure that all scales are designed really well.
Right. Thank you. Next question. And can you comment on how we plant trees in the downtown core so that they mature to an old age? So many of our downtown trees are dead. They can do this in Paris. Why are they not living in Guelph?
I don't know enough to know the answer to that. Maybe you do, Krista. I don't know, but I don't need to tell most of you that it has to do with how you design the tree pit often. But it also can be things like salt and snow and damage during snow clearance and such. So there's lots of reasons that trees die. I think you have to have a really good design approach to make sure not only that the tree will live, but will grow. Too often we do enough to make sure that the tree doesn't die, but it will never get bigger. And often some of our folks want it that way because they never want to have to, spend budget clipping it. But we should want them to mature, especially in the suburbs. We should want them to ultimately get to a point where they have that kissing canopy over the street. And you saw in one of my photos, even a kissing canopy over the sidewalk too, because that's how neighborhoods get better as they age. It's remarkable. Trees are probably the number one determiner about whether a neighborhood gets physically more attractive over time or physically less attractive over time, especially in the suburbs, boy. Because, the communities that did the right moves relative to the trees, they're more and more lovely as the decades move on because the trees mature. But, I've seen comparative, and I've done comparative things in cities like Calgary, where I've worked to educate my council on how important trees are to the evolution of that community. And again, I stress this because we too often say that, trees are a thing that tree people care about. And it's a pejorative, it's a dismissive way to think about trees. It's, that term tree hugger. What I say is, there's incredibly pragmatic, logical, smart, strategic reasons to fully lean in on trees. Not the least of which is climate and heat island, etc., but stormwater management, economic development, livability. There's just so many quantifiable ways that trees are a remarkable investment. And yet, too often I'm told, do you know how much each tree costs? And I always say, well, tell me how much each tree saves. Toronto did a great study that showed with every tree that was planted at this cost, it actually saved, what was it, 3 or 4 times that cost? And that's even before you think about things like return on investment, because that was just municipal cost savings. So that's what I mean by rethink what we can afford. I say you can't afford to not do more street trees.
All right. Next question, and it's to do with downtown core. How do we balance competing prioritize in the downtown core? For instance, a cycle track versus wide sidewalks for marketing space versus space for on-street patios, converted to on-street parking in the winter. How do we fit everything in?
You may not fit everything in, and balance may be the wrong word. I'm not a fan of the word balance in a lot of these contexts because often that's shorthand for doing everything equally badly so nothing works well. But at least we're balanced. I think what you need to actually do is on a case by case basis, think about what you're trying to achieve because you don't need separated protected bike lanes on every street. We're not Copenhagen in that context. So we don't need it on every street. Where do we want it? Where does it make sense? Where is sidewalk with the greater priority? But what really bothers me is often pedestrianization and cycling, or I hate cycling, that word, bike riding, using bikes for transportation are too often pitted against each other. And the car space is sacrosanct. It has to be untouched. So I say, that's where the prioritization of walk, bike, and transit comes in. Frankly, it's the carriageway for the cars that needs to be first rethought, and then you need to think about the other things you want a street to do. Listen, streets are supposed to do so many things, and during the pandemic, I think we always knew that, and yet so much of that space has been surrendered to cars, and I use that term deliberately. And even before the pandemic, we had this incredible hard time figuring out how to do so many things in the scraps left over. And then the pandemic hit, and we all had to be 6 feet separate from each other. And boy, did that ever reveal how little space we had. And people actually, there was all sorts of conversations about people having to walk out onto the carriageway where the cars were in order to give people space as you were walking down the sidewalk. And there sure wasn't space for outside patio seating initially until cities wised up and said, let's reprioritize car space for it. So the pandemic has been a real eye-opener in the context of the space we've surrendered by the cars, all the things we need streets to actually do to play their role in our city, and how you just can't do what you need to do if you've got this mentality that says, I like all those other things as long as no space is taken away from my car. And frankly, that's often how it's put. But that obviously just doesn't work.
Right. Thank you for that. Maybe two questions, maybe one. Um, so our accessibility advocates are concerned certainly with, and all of us are concerned with aging in place and about we have a lot of stacked towns that are being built in Guelph versus a bungalow because that's unaffordable. What are ways to ensure we have a supply of housing that's suitable for people with mobility issues who want to actually age in place?
That's interesting. So it's a housing question, but it's also a mobility question. I
And
think.
it's kind of a building code issue
Yeah.
question with stacked towns because it usually has stairs going up and then the stairs going down to the lower unit.
Well, I
And
don't need to tell your accessibility experts that
yeah,
there's very good information that cities use to determine whether something is sufficiently accessible. And I've been involved, certainly even as recently as with Kingston. The key has been, can we go further than the requirements in terms of accessibility, both for housing, but also for accessibility requirements for parking, which was a very big issue in the context of the power of parking work in Kingston. All I can say is I think cities should always be, good cities have disability advocacy groups, even committees, subcommittees of council to get that kind of advice. I always say, we able-bodied planners have no idea what we're talking about in the context of this. So the best thing to do is get the advice from people with lived experience as much as possible, and then build that into our expectations. But the key is to, I've seen, like any other single issue, you can't go too far in the context of a single issue because it can create 5 other problems. So the art, when you're talking about parking design, sidewalk design, even housing design, relative to an issue like affordability, is what's the way you can do it that sort of works and doesn't actually make the provision of affordable housing for those with disabilities even harder or even more expensive, right? So that's, I think, the challenge. I'm not an expert at this, but what I am is a supporter of what I always say is if I want to give advice and recommendations on that, the first thing I do is get advice on that.
That's a fair answer. And I think, Brent, this is going to be the last question, and it has to do with our kind of our mid-rise developments that we're seeing in Guelph, and that we're seeing a lot of surface parking. Are there any suggestions that we can do uh, that we can ask developers to help support our heat island reduction and those mid-rise apartment buildings
In the parking specifically, heat
in the
island
parking
in the
specifically?
parking specifically? Okay. Well, first thing I say to cities is make sure that they're not building excessive parking because you're forcing them to. And that is the point of the parking minimums in the zoning bylaw. Almost too many cities are mandating excessive parking, even more than a developer wants to build. And if you're thinking, oh, developers just want to save money by building less, that's not really how we should be looking at this, frankly. We shouldn't want excessive parking. There's a lot of public interest problems with excessive parking, and yet ironically, we're mandating it. It's illegal to build less in many cases. So first part of the answer is always, I'm not necessarily convinced that every city should get rid of parking minimums, although certainly many cities are doing that now, and I think that's certainly something that cities should seriously consider. What we did in Kingston is, instead of getting rid of it, we did get rid of parking minimums for commercial uses. So the sea of parking outside the shopping center and the power center, Kingston no longer has a parking minimum for commercial. It no longer has a parking minimum for heritage buildings, no longer has a parking minimum for affordable housing projects. By the way, in all those cases, it does still have a parking minimum for accessible parking spaces. Back to the accessibility piece. We said right off the bat, whatever we do to lower parking minimums or get rid of them, that does not apply to accessible parking, because we need to make sure that that is maintained for obvious reasons, hopefully. And then in the context of the residential housing, we didn't get rid of it. We lowered it significantly, and we allowed builders to go even lower if they wanted to, in return for cash in lieu that would actually go not towards building more parking, but the cash in lieu is actually going to go towards kickstarting a municipally owned and maybe municipally operated car share system, which we hope to be the first real successful car share system for a small to mid-sized city in Ontario. And I shouldn't need to tell you the incredible connection between car share and reduction of parking need, because car share is that last key to people saying, okay, I don't use my car, but I still have it parked in the parking lot because I still want it, even though I'm maybe walking or taking transit or riding my bike to work. But as soon as car share becomes easy, not just available, but easy, which is the case in larger cities, many larger cities, certainly the case here in Vancouver, then people can say, well, why am I keeping the car? Or why am I keeping the second car or the third car? Because car share becomes the ability, becomes the reason to not need too many cars, even if you're not going fully car free. So I'd say that with that sea of parking, goal one is don't mandate too much. And secondly, have as little as possible or none surface parking. I think in most cases we're allowing too much of, they're overbuilding for parking, and we're allowing too much of it to be surface parking. And there's a lot of bad implications to that, not the least of which is heat island effect. So although you can do things in terms of tree planting and shading and even solar fields relative to surface parking, you can paint the surface parking other colors, white being the obvious one. There's lots of different scenarios I've seen, but I put that all in the category of what I call doing the wrong thing better. What you really should do is have less surface parking. You should have less parking overall, less surface parking specifically. You should do more underground, and if you do it properly, potentially above grade if it's properly shielded. But the best answer is to have as little surface parking as possible. And then you design it in a way to address the heat island effect. But you don't design it to address the heat island effect instead of having less parking. The first answer is always to reduce.
Thank you, Brent, and I will tell everyone who is listening that we definitely had a conversation around this topic this week, and we have shared those ideas and thoughts. So we won't have time this evening to get through all of the questions that have been put in the question and answers, but I can assure everyone who submitted a question that it will be reviewed certainly by the planning department and shared with other departments because a lot of them are across various divisions. With that, I would like to really thank Brent for sharing his thoughts, observations, recommendations, and hard truths with us tonight. And to everyone who joined the WebEx tonight, thank you for joining this virtual event and have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Krista, I see 33 comments in the Q&A.